A goblet slipped from her trembling hands. It fell in slow motion, red wine spilling across white silk like blood blooming through snow. The hall gasped as one. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then laughter, sharp, cruel, echoing off marble walls like the sound of shattering glass. Lyra's breath hitched. Her world became sound and color, the dark wine spreading across the Duchess's gown, the glittering eyes of nobles feasting on her humiliation, the trembling of her own fingers. She stammered something that wasn't even a word, just the sound of apology breaking in her throat. The Duchess's voice sliced through the music. "Throw her out." The guards obeyed without question. They seized her by the arms as the laughter rose again, sharper this time, like wolves scenting blood. The music resumed, the orchestra straining to pretend the moment had passed. But the air had changed. The torches lining the walls flickered one by one. The warmth drained from the room. The laughter faltered. Someone whispered, "Why did it get cold all of a sudden?" At the far end of the hall, the Vampire King's chair stood empty. One nobleman laughed nervously. "He must have gone to the balcony. Come now, continue." He never finished. The chandeliers trembled. The air itself thickened, as if the night had begun to listen. Outside, in the snow, Lyra stumbled as the guards threw her down. The cold bit into her skin, her breath coming in ragged clouds. The doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the sound of laughter like a guillotine. She stayed where she fell, hands sinking into the snow, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than the frost. Her lips quivered. I didn't mean to. Above her, the crimson banners of the palace fluttered in the wind, proud, pitiless. Then, silence. No laughter, no music, just the snow whispering around her, and the distant echo of boots across marble. Inside the great hall, nobles froze mid-conversation as the air turned still. The music died in a single discordant note. The torches along the walls burned blue, shadows stretched toward the throne, long and restless. "Where is His Majesty?" A trembling voice asked. No one answered. The king's goblet still sat on the table, untouched, full. The wine inside rippled as if trembling from an unseen heartbeat. Then, a whisper rolled through the room, low and guttural, not from any throat but from the walls themselves. Who dared to touch her? The chandeliers swayed violently, crystals chiming like screams. The nobles fell silent, faces draining of color. Outside, Lyra froze. The snow beneath her seemed to pulse, faintly red, like light trapped beneath ice. Footsteps echoed behind her, slow, deliberate. Not the tread of a guard, but something heavier, ancient. She turned, eyes wide. Through the swirling snow, a shadow emerged. The silhouette was tall, cloaked in black, the air warping with each step he took. The torches along the courtyard walls flickered out as he passed them. Lyra stumbled backward, heart hammering. "Your Majesty..." He didn't answer. The Vampire King's crimson eyes glowed faintly beneath his hood, and for a moment, she thought she saw the reflection of her own trembling face in them. Small, fragile, human. He stopped a breath away from her. The snow fell silently between them. Then, his voice as low, steady, dangerous, rippled through the cold. Who dared to touch her? The question wasn't asked twice. It wasn't meant to be answered. The palace doors flew open behind them, and a rush of red mist burst outward, spilling across the courtyard like living fire. The guards who had thrown her out dropped to their knees without knowing why. Lyra stood trembling, the king's shadow falling over her like a shield. Inside, the nobles whispered in terror. Why her? What is she to him? Why does he care? And somewhere, beneath the fear, a deeper sound, like the night itself kneeling. Lyra didn't yet know that her life had just ended, or begun. The crimson mist swirled around her as the king's cloak unfurled, dark and endless, blotting out the moonlight. His hand lifted slightly, a gesture both protective and possessive, as his voice echoed once more, quieter this time, but final. No one touches what's mine. The torches reignited, burning red. The snow turned to steam where it met his boots. Lyra's breath came in sharp bursts, her pulse loud in her ears. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to say thank you, but her voice caught in her throat. The king turned, his cloak brushing her shoulder like a vow, behind him. The nobles inside the feast cowered, their laughter forgotten, their pride curdled into silence. Before this story begins, if you believe that kindness still holds power, that mercy can defy monsters, then subscribe, because here, every tale reminds you what humanity still means. Now, let's step into the night where even a servant's heart can change a kingdom. For the first time in centuries, fear had meaning again. The king looked back once, his eyes softening, not out of pity but recognition. Then he disappeared into the shadows, his presence lingering like the echo of thunder. Lyra knelt there, surrounded by the faint warmth of his power, her tears freezing before they touched the ground. The night exhaled. They threw her out like dirt. The narrator's voice murmurs as the screen fades to black. But the night itself knelt for her. A single heartbeat echoes. Then, the whisper, quiet and haunting. Before I tell you what happened next, ask yourself, have you ever been humiliated so deeply that even the heavens seemed to watch? Morning light filtered through the high windows of the Crimson Palace, catching dust motes that glittered like small forgotten stars. Lyra Hale was already awake. She always was. Long before the nobles stirred. Long before the fires were lit. Her hands were raw from scrubbing silver platters until her reflection blurred across them. Her breath rose faintly in the cold air as she rubbed a stubborn stain, her motions practiced, unthinking, gentle. Outside the scullery, the courtyard slept under a quilt of frost. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with snow that had yet to fall. Lyra paused for a moment at the narrow window, watching a group of small sparrows peck weakly at the frozen cobblestones. She broke a crust of stale bread from the kitchen's waste pile and slipped out the door, kneeling to scatter crumbs. The birds flinched at first, then drew closer, one by one, until they were all eating in soft, grateful silence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smiled at them. "There you go," she whispered, voice hoarse from disuse. "At least someone will eat well today." No one saw her kindness. No one ever did. By the time she returned inside, the palace had begun to wake, maids hurrying through the corridors, the crack of kitchen fires igniting, the echo of boots in the grand hall. Lyra blended into the rhythm like a ghost. The girl who works too hard and speaks too softly, the others called her. They didn't mean it kindly. In the servants' quarters, she patched her own worn shoes, pricking her thumb with the needle. A bead of blood welled up, small and bright. She stared at it for a moment, then tied a thin red thread around her wrist, a habit she'd never explained. For courage, she'd once told the cook when asked, but the cook had only laughed. "Courage won't fill your belly, girl." Still, Lyra kept the thread. It reminded her that something within her still burned. As the sun crept higher, whispers filled the halls. The palace maids spoke in half-hushed voices, eyes darting toward the grand stairway that led to the throne room. "Did you see him last night?" One murmured. "The king?" "Aye, passed me in the west corridor." Didn't blink. "Didn't breathe, I swear." Another snickered. "They say he's cursed. Can't stand the sight of sunlight. That's why the windows are always shrouded." "Or maybe," a third voice said softly, "he just doesn't smile because there's nothing left to smile for." Lyra didn't join their gossip. She never did. Still, her heart fluttered with a strange ache at the mention of the vampire king, Cale Valen, the immortal who ruled without warmth or rest, whose eyes were said to see the truth in a heartbeat, and whose silence could freeze a man's soul. She'd never seen him up close. She hoped she never would. The day stretched endlessly, full of chores and small mistakes that no one noticed but her. She polished cutlery until her shoulders ached, fetched logs for the fire, and learned the order of the feast one last time. The royal feast, a celebration of winter's end, or so the nobles said, though winter in this land never truly ended. It was a night for power to display itself, for laughter to mask cruelty, for servants to be invisible. She tried to be invisible. As the hour approached, she stood before the mirror in the servants' corridor, adjusting the plain linen apron over her simple dress. Her reflection looked pale, eyes too large, hair escaping its braid. She took a deep breath, tightening the red thread around her wrist until it left a faint mark. "Don't tremble," she whispered to herself. "Not tonight." Then the bell rang, a low, haunting toll that signaled the noble's arrival. Lyra hurried through the servants' passage, clutching the silver tray as though it could anchor her to the earth. The grand doors opened ahead, spilling light and laughter into the hall. The scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and candle wax filled the air. Music soared, violins and drums echoing off marble. She kept her eyes down, walking carefully, each step practiced, precise. The throne loomed at the far end of the hall, raised above the feast like a dark sun. Empty. The king was not yet present, but his absence was heavier than anyone else's presence. Lyra's gaze flicked up just once, unintentionally, and caught the sight of his empty chair. The crimson cushions, the black carved wood, the faint shimmer of moonlight spilling across it through a high window. The shadow it cast stretched long across the floor, creeping almost to where she stood. For a moment, she could have sworn it touched her feet. A chill crawled up her spine. She blinked, looked again, and the light was ordinary once more. "Keep moving," hissed the head steward. "You're not here to daydream." Lyra bowed her head. Yes, sir. She passed down the long tables, serving wine, offering bread, smiling faintly when spoken to, though no one ever looked at her face. The nobles laughed, their jewels catching the candlelight, their words dripping with pride and poison. To them, she was air, yet there was something different in the air tonight. A tension beneath the laughter, a pulse beneath the music. She couldn't name it, but it felt like the moment before a storm. She tightened the red thread again. Her thoughts flickered briefly to the sparrows outside. Were they still alive in the cold? Would they remember her tomorrow? Silly, she told herself. They were only birds. But kindness was all she had. A bell chimed. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. A hush rippled through the crowd as the vampire king entered, his cloak trailing like smoke, his face carved from shadow. Lyra lowered her eyes instantly, heart hammering. She dared not look again. The music resumed, and with it, her trembling. The night had begun. She thought this would be just another night of survival. She didn't know it would make her a legend. The grand hall shimmered like a cathedral of blood and glass. Chandeliers of bone and crystal hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured light across the marble floor where nobles laughed, drank, and fed their egos. Long tables stretched endlessly, heavy with feasts that gleamed under golden plates. Roasted pheasant, sugared grapes, spiced wine as red as old sins. Music filled the air and too bright, too fast. Strings trembling under the command of musicians too afraid to falter. Every sound carried the weight of performance, of fear polished into beauty. And above it all, on his throne of black marble, sat the vampire king. Cale Valen watched in silence. He did not eat. He did not move. His presence was a stillness that unsettled even the laughter. Cloaked in shadows, his crimson eyes flickered in the candlelight, unreadable, detached, like a storm waiting for a reason to strike. Lyra Hale moved quietly through the hall, her hands trembling as she carried a golden tray lined with crystal goblets. The scent of wine and candle smoke clung to her dress. Every few steps her foot brushed the hem of a noble's robe or the edge of a jeweled chair, and each time, she whispered a quick apology that no one heard. Faster, hissed the steward under his breath, watching her from the corner of the room. You move like a ghost. She didn't argue. She only tightened her grip on the tray. Her knuckles were pale, her breathing shallow. She passed a group of nobles mid-laughter, their voices sharp and honeyed with cruelty. Do you see her hands? One woman whispered behind her fan. So coarse, I can almost smell the dirt of the stables. Another giggled. Even their sweat smells like fear. The laughter prickled across Lyra's skin like thorns. She kept her eyes down, her lips pressed tight. She'd learned long ago that words only made it worse. But tonight, something inside her trembled differently, not just from fear, but from exhaustion. How long could a heart stay kind when the world fed on humiliation? She reached the table of nobles seated closest to the king's dais, the ones whose arrogance glowed brightest. The Duchess of Iron leaned lazily in her chair, her gown a masterpiece of white silk and crimson lace. When Lyra stepped forward to pour her wine, the Duchess didn't look at her. She simply tilted the glass with two gloved fingers, bored. Careful, girl, the woman murmured. My gown cost more than your life. Lyra's fingers trembled. A servant behind her bumped her shoulder. Small, accidental, but enough. The tray tilted. The goblet slipped. Time fractured. The wine fell in slow motion, a crimson arc that burst across the Duchess's gown like a wound. The hall went silent for one fragile heartbeat, then erupted. Gasps. Laughter. The Duchess shot to her feet, the stain spreading across her white silk like fire. You filthy wretch, she screamed. You ruined it. Guards. Lyra fell to her knees, words tumbling out like shattered glass. Please, I didn't... I'm sorry, please. But her apology drowned in the laughter that followed. The nobles clapped, delighted by the spectacle. Someone threw a grape at her. Someone else shouted, Teach her to crawl better next time. The Duchess's voice rose above them all, sharp as a blade. Throw her out! The guards obeyed instantly. They seized Lyra's arms, dragging her backward across the marble. The tray clattered, wine splashing across the floor, pooling beneath the candlelight like blood. The music faltered, then stopped altogether. Up on the dais, the vampire king had not moved. He sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the arm of his throne. His eyes, cold and ancient, followed the chaos in silence. The Duchess turned toward him, breathless, trembling with fury. Your Majesty, this creature... Cale did not answer. For a long, terrible moment, the hall waited. The king's gaze drifted past her, and found Lyra. Their eyes met, just for a second. But in that second, the room disappeared. She saw something in him. Not pity, not anger, but a depth she couldn't name. a shadow that recognized her humiliation as if he'd lived it himself, and in him, she thought she glimpsed hesitation. The guards dragged her toward the doors. The nobles began to laugh again, louder this time, trying to bury the silence the king had left hanging in the air. Cale's fingers twitched once, barely perceptible. A drop of red wine trembled in his untouched goblet. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The great doors swung open. Cold air poured in. Lyra stumbled as they threw her into the snow. The doors slammed shut behind her, muffling the sound of music starting up again. She knelt in the frost, her breath coming in ragged clouds, her hands still shaking pressed against the ground. She could hear their laughter even now, distant, fading, but cutting like knives. Inside, the wine she had spilled glistened across the marble floor, a crimson mirror under the chandeliers. One goblet rolled slowly away from the puddle, spinning softly, echoing in the vast silence of the throne room. It rolled past the nobles, past the Duchess's trembling feet, across the reflection of torchlight and spilled wine, and then it stopped. At the foot of the throne, Cale Valen looked down at it. His crimson eyes darkened, the reflection of the goblet's blood-red hue dancing within them. He reached out, not to drink, not to gesture, but to touch the edge of the table where the wine had splashed. His fingertips came away wet and glistening, as though he'd touched something living. The hall didn't notice the temperature drop, didn't hear the faint whisper of wind curling through the cracks in the floor, didn't see the way the torches flickered blue for the briefest moment, but the king felt it. Something had shifted, something he hadn't felt in centuries. Outside, Lyra pulled herself to her feet, the red thread around her wrist catching the pale moonlight. Her breath turned to mist as she stared at the palace doors. Inside, a single drop of wine slid from the table's edge and hit the floor like a heartbeat. The goblet, resting before the throne, stood perfectly still. Snow drifted through the silent courtyard, each flake catching faint moonlight as it fell. Lyra stumbled forward, breath hitching, tears freezing on her cheeks. The grand doors behind her had already closed, sealing the laughter and cruelty inside. All she had left was the echo of her humiliation and the soft glow of her red thread against the frost. It pulsed faintly in the dark, like a heartbeat refusing to die. She tried to walk. Her legs shook. Every breath stung her lungs. She clutched her arms around herself, but the cold sank through the fabric like needles. The snow came heavier now, swirling around her in pale, merciless waves. The courtyard stretched vast and empty before her, white stone steps leading to nothing but silence. Then, without warning, the air changed. The torches lining the walls dimmed, their flames shrinking to trembling blue. The wind fell still. Somewhere deep within the palace, a bell gave one hollow toll. Footsteps, slow, steady, regal. They echoed through the courtyard like thunder over ice. Lyra froze. Her body told her to run, but her heart couldn't move. She turned slowly, her eyes wide. The snow parted, shadows bent, and from the darkness beneath the archway, he emerged, the Vampire King. Cale Valen moved with a calm that defied the storm. His black cloak swept the ground, leaving a trail of steam where it brushed the snow. His eyes, crimson, burning faintly beneath his hood, fixed on her with an intensity that made the night itself hesitate. For a heartbeat, she thought he might strike her down, for daring to exist, for shattering his court's perfection. But he didn't. He stopped before her. The space between them charged, her breath visible against the still air. She couldn't look directly at him. His presence was too vast, too consuming. And yet, she couldn't look away. Her voice broke the silence first, fragile as glass. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean—" He lifted one gloved hand, and she fell silent. The gesture wasn't harsh, it was gentle. The king's gaze dropped to the red thread at her wrist, glowing faintly, defiant against the frost. Then to her shock, he knelt. The world seemed to stop breathing. The immortal ruler of the Crimson Dominion, the man whose throne none dared approach, lowered himself to one knee before a trembling servant girl. The movement was slow, deliberate, reverent. He unfastened his cloak and draped it around her shoulders. The heavy velvet enveloped her, swallowing the cold, the scent of smoke and iron clinging to it. She gasped softly, clutching the fabric to her chest as warmth spread through her body for the first time that night. His voice came low, deep, and steady, a voice made for commands, not comfort. "They think mercy is weakness," he said. "I call it power." Lyra looked up at him through tears, her lips trembling. Why would a king defend a servant? His eyes met hers. The fire within them softened, just enough to reveal something human beneath the centuries of ice. "Because," he said, "I remember what it feels like to bleed for no reason." The words hung between them, too heavy to vanish, He reached out, not to command, but to comfort. His gloved fingers brushed the back of her hand. The contact was brief, accidental, but it struck through her like lightning. Her pulse echoed in the silence, and for the first time, Cale Valen blinked. The snow around them stilled, suspended mid-air like time itself had caught its breath. Then from the castle windows, a faint red glow began to pulse. Slow, rhythmic, alive. Lyra looked up, startled. "What is that?" The king's jaw tightened. "The bloodline stirs," he murmured. "It feels when I—" He stopped, eyes darkening. "When I remember what it means to care." The torches along the courtyard walls flared back to life, burning red now instead of gold. The snow beneath them hissed, melting into steam. Cale stood, the full height of his presence returning, but his gaze lingered on her as though leaving part of himself behind. "You should not be out here," he said softly, though it sounded more like an apology than a command. Lyra tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. "I didn't mean to shame the court. I didn't even mean to—" He stepped closer, the snow crackling beneath his boots. "You did nothing wrong." The shame was theirs. Something in his tone, cold, absolute, made her chest tighten. Behind him, through the open palace doors, faint shouts began to echo. The guards were realizing where their king had gone. Panic rippled through the nobles, confusion and fear twisting their laughter into silence. Kyle's eyes flickered toward the sound, then back to her. "Come inside," he said. "Not as a servant," her breath caught. "Then as what?" The faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips, more sorrow than warmth. "As someone I owe a debt to." He extended a hand. She hesitated, not from fear but disbelief. Then, slowly, she placed her trembling hand in his. The red thread around her wrist shimmered like living flame. As their fingers met, the castle shuddered. The red light in the windows flared, flooding the snow in a blood-hued glow. Somewhere deep within the palace, a crack split through the marble floor, a sound like the earth itself acknowledging what had just changed. Cale glanced toward the light, expression darkening. "The curse wakes," he murmured. Lyra frowned. "Curse?" He didn't answer. His hand tightened slightly around hers, grounding her against the tremor that passed through the ground. And then, silence. Only the snow fell again, soft and slow, covering the footprints they had left. Cale's cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, heavy with warmth and the faint scent of storm. He looked down at her, not as a king looks at a servant, but as a man looks at someone who has already changed him without meaning to. That was the moment, the narrator whispers as the scene fades. The court's laughter died, and history began to tremble. The hall smelled of roasted meat and old power, of wax and wine and the kind of gilded cruelty that had kept dynasties alive. When Lyra crossed the threshold wrapped in Cale's cloak, silence folded over the longueurs like a hand smothering a candle. Conversation stalled mid-sip. Laughter curdled into thin coughs. The nobles stared as if she were a stain spreading across their polished world. Whispers threaded through the room, soft and sharp as thorns. They braided themselves into questions that never reached any mouth directly. "Has he gone mad?" a count muttered, fingers tightening on his goblet. "A servant?" Someone else hissed. An accusation and a prophecy all at once. The word spread without a breath. Chosen. Chosen by the king. Chosen by a man who wore seasons like cloaks and had no need for warmth. Lyra moved between tables like a ghost, learning to walk in daylight. The marble she stepped on was the same that had seen her fall. The same tiles still bore faint smears of wine from the spill. Each step pressed echoes into memory. The scrape of a tray, the hush of silk skirts, the snap of a cruel jest. Tonight those echoes answered her with knives instead of pity. Eyes tracked her with the slow hunger of wolves recognizing new prey. She should have felt small. Instead she felt raw, an exposed thing wrapped in velvet. Gratitude fluttered at the edges of her chest. An absurd thing to feel while a dozen lances of suspicion were being leveled at her. She had expected to be invisible forever. Instead she had been made visible, displayed, and made suddenly dangerous by the attention of the one man who should not notice such things at all. Darius stepped from the shadow of a column like a contract waiting to be enforced. The king's chief advisor moved with the poised inevitability of someone who had carved the court's will into law. His face, always rehearsed in neutrality, showed a crease of worry tonight. "Majesty," Darius said softly, but the sound carried across the hall. "You have chosen a human to stand at your side in the sight of your council. They will not accept it." Around them noble heads turned. Some looked displeased. Others looked openly incensed. A whisper grew into a murmur that rippled across the room like a wind warning of a storm to come. "The balance of blood," an aunt muttered. "The old rites." She clutched a rosary of black beads as if it might anchor her. "You do not know the cost." Cale's hand tightened on the back of his chair, His profile was ablaze against the torchlight, sharp, implacable. For a long moment he said nothing. He allowed the murmurs to swell and collapse like waves against rock. Finally he stood, slow and deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was the hush before thunder. "Then let them rise," he said, "and see what falls." The statement landed like a gauntlet thrown across the floor. Some of the nobles swallowed hard. Others smiled, teeth glinting not with warmth but with anticipation of spectacle. Darius's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Do you gamble your throne on a whim?" he asked, the accusation wrapped in courtly concern. Cale's eyes flicked to Lyra, and then back to Darius. "This is not whim," he said. "This is remembrance." His words were soft, but they carried authority so absolute that a bowl clattered to the floor in a distant corner, and no one dared laugh at the sound. There are things a throne keeps, secrets, debts, sins. Perhaps it is time they remember the price of what they have become. The court regarded him like a king speaking a foreign language. They had grown comfortable in the arithmetic of power. Laws written and obeyed, fear bought and sold. Mercy was a currency they had never learned to count. Lyra felt the weight of the room on her shoulders. The cloak was warm around her, but it could not shield her from the barbs in their voices. Gratitude warred with a creeping domestic fear that tightened with every passing second. She had been poured from the world like a cup of simple clay into a setting of polished silver, and she feared she would shatter under the weight of expectations she did not understand. A noble, young, overly handsome, and obviously bored, rose as if the hall were a stage and the audience's entertainment. He moved with the surety of one who expects his will to be obeyed. "This is indecent," he declared, a servant at the king's side. "What precedent will you set, Majesty? Shall the kitchens name the heirs now? Shall the stables dictate law?" He turned theatrically toward Lyra, lips curling. "Tell us, girl, do you dream of crowns now?" His tone was mock sweetness. His eyes were knives. Lyra's mouth opened, then closed. She had not come to the feast to argue philosophy. She had come to survive the night without being noticed. Now the hall leaned on her like a weight. The red thread at her wrist felt like a hot wire against her skin. Something in the air convulsed. The shadows beneath the vaulted ceiling shifted as if they had bodies of their own. They pooled and stretched toward the throne like ink, knowing the path of a spill. The carved sigils along the floor, those old marks that no one spoke of because memory feared them, trembled faintly, as if sensing some interruption in their long sleep. A hush fell so absolute it felt like the drawing of a spear across skin. The young noble reached out, an instinctive, petty motion to touch Lyra's shoulder, to show supremacy. The hall held its breath. His hand met the air. Time seemed to click, the way a lock clicks into place. The strike he had aimed at her hung suspended mid-motion, his fist frozen as if pulled through syrup. A wine glass trembled on the table and dropped, the crystal shattering soundless back into itself. The nobles' faces drained as they realized movement had been halted not by metal, but by some invisible decree. Cale's hand was a shadow across the room now. His eyes flamed like embers. For the first time since Lyra had seen him kneel, his aura manifested as something physical, heat that radiated from him in waves, bending the air with its intensity. The frozen hand dropped back to the noble's side as if the body had been robbed of the ability to obey malice. A cold wind washed through the hall, extinguishing a row of torches in a single, breathless sweep. The flames died without sound, plunging the nearer faces into gloom, and raising the red glow from the windows to dominate the dim. Where each torch once burned gold, now a low red pulse bled through the floor, and the runes carved there began to warm like coals, the old magic stirring from centuries of sleep. Someone behind Lyra hissed. "Sorcery," a voice whispered, but there was fear in it too. Fear not of magic, but of a power that answered the king's favor by stopping a hand. They had traded gods and debts, and now those debts had teeth. Darius stepped forward, his robes whispering across the tiles. "You cannot wield fear and mercy as you please, my king," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. There was apprehension there now, a doubt in the authority he had once wielded like a blade. "The council will not be trifled with." Kyle's reply was a soft, terrible thing. "I do not seek to trifle. I seek to remember. If memory burns, then let it burn." His gaze moved from the advisor to the nobles, and each of them felt seen in a way that made their old shields seem brittle. The banquet hall seemed to convulse as the old sigils flared. Beneath their feet, crimson lines searing through, marble like veins lighting with blood. Patterns that had been mere decoration to the untrained eye now writhed with recognition. The runes, long dormant, were awakening with intent. Heat rose through the soles of shoes, an uncomfortable memory of far older power asserting itself. Lyra felt it like a pressure in the bones. She looked down. Faint lines of red shimmered for a heartbeat across the floor near her boots, then faded. Her fingers tightened on the cloak at her shoulders. There was no heroic thought in her mind, only the simple human wish to be safe, to keep the small warmth the king had given from being snuffed out by the crowd's hunger. A murmur rose, then hollowed into a chant of disbelief. A cluster of nobles gathered like vultures, whispering of ancient rites, of purity and lineage, and the old laws no one had questioned in 100 years. Their eyes reflected the slow-burning glyphs, conversion of arrogance into something trembling. "Touch her again," Kyle said, his voice now steel and ice-merged. He stepped forward and his presence was a blade. "And I'll end you myself." It was not a threat that could be bargained with. It was a verdict delivered in a man's tone. The noble who had intended to strike her paled. His jaw worked as if searching for a command that would save him. No command came. The choice had been made. The hall sighed, half relief, half dread. Men who had once laughed at peasants and lesser things now found their own laughter lodged in their throats. The floor beneath their feet hummed, as the sigils burned more fiercely, etching themselves deeper into the marble. The palace's old language, the language of blood and binding, announced its discontent by turning the tiles to living script. On the far side of the hall, a torch guttered and went dark, then another. One by one, the long row of lights winked out, as if the palace itself were closing its eyes. Darkness flooded the space in honest waves, leaving figures carved in partial silhouette. The red glow from the remaining windows swelled, bathing columns and faces in a strange, accusatory light. Lyra stood small among giants, her breath a quiet drum. The red thread at her wrist pulsed, matching the rhythm of the sigils underfoot. She had not asked for any of this. She had not wished to become a symbol. Yet here, at the heart of a kingdom that was as old as its secrets, she was the fulcrum upon which a history might tip. As the final torch died, the runes flared with a light that painted the marble in furious streaks. The carved sigils of the old bloodline, those quiet, patient marks that had slept beneath marble for generations, began to burn through the floor as if the house itself were remembering what it had been made to do. The whispers became a chorus of stunned silence. The nobles looked at one another for anchors and found none. The king's cloak fell around Lyra like a dark promise. Kale's eyes, still aglow, fixed on the crawling lights etched into stone. The court had expected theater. They had expected to humiliate a servant and be applauded for their cruelty. Instead, they watched the palace mark itself with prophecy, and a king stand between an old law and a new kind of reckoning. In the hush that followed, the only sound was the soft, inexorable sizzle as the sigils wrote themselves brighter, lines of old red flame carving truth into the marble. The court's envy hummed in their veins, useless as song without a throat to carry it. Above them, unseen, the palace seemed to shift its weight. The past had settled its claim, and no one in the hall had the audacity to look away. The great hall lay shrouded in red light, the runes in the marble still glowing like veins under skin. After the torches had died, after the nobles had scattered to whisper their fear in secret corners, Kale and Lyra stood alone in the long silence. The air trembled with something that was neither cold nor heat, but memory, old, hungry, alive. Lyra's fingers brushed the cloak still draped over her shoulders. The velvet was heavy, too fine for her touch. The red thread at her wrist glimmered faintly beneath it, pulsing with a rhythm she didn't understand. She looked at the king, standing beside the throne. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes, those impossible eyes, seemed fixed somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the centuries. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to them? The marks, the light in the floor. Why did it answer you?" Kale's gaze turned to her slowly, as though surfacing from a depth where time had drowned. "Because it remembers me," he said. He descended the steps of the dais, each footfall echoing. The hall responded, not with sound, but with a low hum that stirred the air. "Everything in this palace was built on a promise and a curse," he said. The same words spoken in two tongues, one human, one divine. Lyra frowned. "A curse?" Kale's expression shifted. Not pain exactly, but something older. The ache of someone who had carried the same wound too long to name it anymore. "Long before you were born," he said softly, "there was a kingdom built on blood and faith. I was its heir, proud, foolish, desperate to protect what I thought was mine. When my father was dying, a healer came to save him. A human." Lyra's breath caught. She carried light in her hands, Kale continued, and a kindness that terrified me. She said no curse could cling to a heart untainted by power. I didn't believe her. I thought love was a trick mortals used to make peace with weakness. He looked at his hands. So I rejected her cure. I traded the kingdom's fate for my father's life, and in doing so, I bound our blood to shadow. That healer died trying to save us, and the curse lived on. Lyra's throat tightened. The words twisted something inside her that felt both alien and familiar. Cale stepped closer, his voice lowering. The curse sleeps until it finds a heart that mirrors hers. And when it wakes, the kingdom begins again, trapped in the same story waiting for mercy to return. Her pulse raced. What does that have to do with me? He studied her, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of her red thread. When I saw you, he said, I felt it stir. The silence inside me cracked. The old runes in the marble burned again for the first time in 1,000 years. He reached toward her wrist, his fingers brushing the glowing thread. You wear its mark, Lyra looked down. The thread pulsed brighter, the red deepening to crimson. It began to unravel, one delicate fiber at a time spinning into the air like smoke. The strands twisted, forming faint symbols of light, runes shaped like drops of blood. Cale's voice trembled. You weren't chosen by me. You were chosen by the curse itself. The words hit her like frost. She stepped back, shaking her head. No, I'm no one. I don't have magic. I can't. The runes spun faster, circling her wrist, glowing brighter until the entire hall was washed in their crimson hue. The shadows fled to the corners. Cale's voice broke through the shimmer. Every generation it searched for the same thing, a heart that would give without expecting. The healer's soul refused to die. It waited for a world cruel enough to forget mercy, and for a girl kind enough to remind it. Lyra's chest ached. Images flickered in her mind, flashes she didn't recognize. A woman's hands glowing in moonlight. A voice whispering, You can't save him if you hate him. A scream. A door closing forever. Her knees weakened. I've seen this before, she whispered. Cale's eyes darkened. Because you have lived it before. She looked up at him, tears catching the red light. You mean, he nodded once. You are her. The healer. Reborn. The one who tried to save the first vampire king. Me. Silence struck like thunder. The air grew thick. The marble under her feet felt alive, warm, trembling faintly, as though the entire palace were listening. Lyra's breath came ragged. That's impossible. Maybe, Cale said softly. But so is mercy in a world built on fear. She wanted to run, to hide, to deny the truth. But inside, something ancient stirred. Not memory, but understanding. A warmth that was both pain and recognition. Her tears fell freely now. If this curse binds you, what happens to me? Cale's gaze fell to the floor. It feeds on the moment mercy returns. The heart that rekindles it must carry its burden, until the next generation forgets again. Lyra stared at him, horror dawning. So it will. Move into me. He didn't answer. His silence was enough. She looked down at her wrist. The red thread had completely unraveled, replaced by faint symbols that pulsed like veins of living fire beneath her skin. Her voice trembled. Then my fate isn't love. No, Kyle said, his tone breaking. It's sacrifice. The weight of the word pressed against her ribs like a blade. The air between them seemed to warp, bending the candlelight. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. Neither did she, Cale murmured. Lyra's fingers clenched the cloak he had given her, the velvet heavy with both comfort and curse. Why tell me now? Because you deserve to choose, he said. Even if choice is the cruelest gift I can give. Her tears shimmered in the red light. You saved me from them. You called me queen, and now you tell me I was never meant to stay alive? Kyle's expression wavered, the immortal mask cracking. I called you queen because you already were one. Not by birth, by heart. She stepped closer, anger and sorrow twisting together. If being queen means saving you from yourself, she whispered, then I'll wear the crown, even if it burns. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The curse pulsed around them like a living thing. The symbols on her skin flared, mirrored in the crimson of his eyes. Then, a sound. The marble split down the center of the hall. The red light surged through the crack, climbing the pillars like fire-seeking air. The throne shuddered, veins of bloodlight crawling up its surface. Cale's cloak snapped in the wind that wasn't there. It begins, he said quietly. The curse recognizes its heir. Lyra clutched her arm as the light seared through her veins. The pain was unbearable, yet it didn't destroy. It transformed. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, matching the rhythm of the glowing runes. Kyle took a step forward, his hand hovering near her face. You can stop it, he said, desperation beneath his calm. If you choose not to care, if you turn away. Her gaze met his, steady through tears. Then it would never end. Would it? He shook his head. No. The castle roared as the light reached the ceiling, a storm of red and gold bursting outward. The sigils on the floor connected, forming the shape of a crown. Ancient, burning, divine. Lyra stood at its center, her hair whipping in the current. Her eyes filled with equal parts terror and grace. And Cale, watching her, realized that every century of darkness had been leading to this. to the one heart he couldn't command. Only Bo, too. The prophecy had not been about bloodlines or thrones. It had been about remembrance, that mercy, once forgotten, would always find its way back through the kindest soul in the cruelest age. The light dimmed slowly, settling into her skin, marking her not as property, but as promise. She met Cale's gaze one last time, her voice breaking but resolute. Then let it take what it must, so long as you remember what it means to feel. Cale's lips parted, to protest, to beg, to surrender, but the wind swallowed his words. The final spark of the red thread faded from her wrist, dissolving into air, and in its wake, the ancient curse sighed, as if the world itself, after centuries of holding its breath, had finally exhaled. The palace burned with sound, not fire, not yet, but the sound of rebellion, the shriek of metal and the shattering of glass, the roar of ancient nobility twisting into monsters. The chandeliers trembled above, spilling rainbows of fractured light, and the runes carved into the marble floor pulsed like a living heart gone mad. Cale stood at the center of it, his crimson cloak torn and dark with ash, his sword drawn though it could cut nothing that still remembered being human. Beside him, Lyra clutched the last strand of her fading red thread, the faint glow trembling like a candle about to die. The curse had awakened, and it wanted everything. The first scream came from the Duke of Veilheart. His skin split like glass, silver veins crawling across his face as his eyes flooded black. Others followed, the Council of Old Vampires, their bodies warping, dissolving into smoke and sinew. Where once had stood lords and ladies draped in silk, there were now creatures, shadows given teeth, ghosts given purpose. The curse devoured them as it had always promised to, sparing no one born of arrogance. Lyra stepped forward, her bare feet slipping in the blood that was not blood but molten frost. "Kyle," she whispered, "it's feeding on them." He looked at her, not as a king to a subject, but as a man caught between rage and fear. "It's feeding on everything," he said. "Every sin this court ever celebrated." Above them, a chandelier cracked. Crystals exploded outward, raining embers as the torches flared blue and gold. The fire did not burn, it froze. The air smelled of iron and cold lightning. Lyra's voice trembled. "Then what can stop it?" Cale turned his gaze toward the shattered throne. "The one who began it," he said, "and the one who carries its end." Her heart stuttered. She already knew what he meant. The curse had chosen her. It had named her its vessel. He reached for her wrist, the same wrist once bound by the red thread. The markings there now pulsed faintly, like runes beneath her skin. "Let me bear it," he said. "You don't understand what eternity does. You shouldn't." She shook her head, tears shining in the crimson light. "You've already carried it too long." A roar cut her words apart. One of the transformed nobles lunged from the shadows, all claws and fire, its face still faintly human. Cale turned with supernatural speed, slicing through air and smoke. The creature's body fell, dissolving into mist, but more shadows replaced it, crawling along the ceiling like serpents of frost. "They won't stop," Cale said, his voice raw. "They can't. The curse is purging itself." Lyra looked at the ruin of the hall, the walls breathing light, the marble splintering with heat. "Then it needs somewhere else to go." He froze. "No." "Yes," she said, stepping closer. Her hair whipped around her face, her breath visible in the cold. "Let it take me. Let me end what began with your pain." He dropped his sword. "I won't lose you. You already did," she whispered. "Centuries ago." The palace shuddered. Fire and frost collided, red and white, life and death twisting together. The stained glass windows shattered, casting shards of color across the floor like fallen stars. The sigils on the marble blazed bright, forming a circle around them both. Cale grabbed her shoulders. His hands burned against her skin, the temperature of grief. "You don't know what it means. It doesn't just take your body. It takes your memory, your light. You'll fade from every story, even mine." Lyra smiled weakly. "Then promise me you'll write a new one." She stepped into the light. The runes flared, brighter than fire, colder than dawn. The curse rose from the floor like smoke given thought. Faces formed in the air, screaming, breaking apart, reforming. The beasts roared, then stilled. One by one, they froze in place, their shadows dissolving into frost. Kyle watched, powerless. Every instinct screamed to pull her back, to rip the curse from her, to destroy the prophecy itself, but the light between them would not let him cross. "Lyra," he shouted. Her eyes met his through the storm. "It's all right," she said, though her voice cracked. "This is what mercy feels like when it hurts." The curse descended, red lightning threading through her veins, her hair lifting in the force of it. The ground split open beneath her feet. She screamed once, not in pain but in defiance, and the palace erupted. A blast of light filled the air, consuming everything. Walls, beasts, marble, shadow. It wasn't destruction. It was cleansing. Kale was thrown backward, crashing against the broken throne. The world was nothing but white. When the light faded, silence fell so completely it hurt to breathe. The fire was gone. The frost, too. The beasts had vanished, their forms reduced to dust that sparkled faintly in the air. The once cursed sigils were dull now, etched into the floor like faint scars. And at the center of it all, Lyra knelt, still, unmoving. Her body glowed faintly from within, veins of crimson fading to gold. The air around her pulsed like a heartbeat, but her chest was still. Kale rose slowly, each step heavier than the last. He reached her and dropped to his knees, gathering her in his arms. Her skin was warm, impossibly warm, as though the curse burned gently beneath it, contained but not gone. "Lyra," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in centuries. "Come back to me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found him. She smiled, small, tired, eternal. "It's done," she breathed. "They're free." Tears cut through the ash on his face. "You shouldn't have had to pay for my sins." She lifted her hand weakly, fingers brushing his cheek. "You were never a monster," she whispered. "Just a man who forgot what warmth felt like." Her touch trembled. "Now you'll remember." He pressed her hand to his heart. "You were never beneath them," he whispered. "You were always beyond them." Her lips curved faintly. "Then let me be. The warmth that stays." Her hand fell away. Kyle held her close as the silence deepened, as the embers of the curse cooled into dust around them. The red glow in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something gentler. Grief, yes, but also peace. Outside, the wind changed. The first light of dawn seeped through the shattered stained glass, painting the ruins in colors not seen in centuries. Gold, rose, and silver. The palace, once a tomb of arrogance, breathed again. Kyle lifted his gaze to the light. "You ended it," he murmured. "Even if it meant ending yourself." He stood slowly, cradling her in his arms, the cloak falling like a shadow behind them. As he carried her through the ruined hall, the dawn followed, washing away the darkness. Where her tears had fallen, small flowers began to bloom between the cracks in the marble, pale blossoms that shimmered faintly red in the light. By the time he reached the courtyard, the snow had begun to melt. He laid her down beneath the rising sun, her red thread, now a line of light, vanishing into the air. The wind carried her final whisper, soft and fading. "No one deserves to be left in the cold." Kale closed his eyes, and for the first time the Vampire King wept, not as a creature cursed, but as a man reborn in the memory of the girl who taught him mercy. The dawn rose higher, spilling through the open gates, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the Crimson Palace stood bathed in light, its curse broken, its queen eternal in silence. Snow no longer fell over the Crimson Palace. For the first time in living memory, spring sunlight reached its spires without dimming. The frost that had once sealed the courtyards was gone, the marble no longer whispering with pain. In its place grew flowers, wild, fragile things pushing through the cracks left by the battle. The curse that had haunted the kingdom for centuries was broken, and the air now carried the scent of thawing earth instead of blood and fear. Weeks had passed since the night the palace burned in light. No one spoke of it directly, not out of denial, but reverence. The survivors called it the Night of Mercy. The nobles who had once worn arrogance like armor now moved through the halls in silence, their finery subdued, their laughter softer. For the first time, the court bowed to humility instead of hierarchy. At the heart of the transformation stood her memory. Every dawn, when the bells tolled, the palace windows glowed faintly red, the color of her thread. The servants swore it wasn't a reflection or trick of the sun. They said it was her spirit, walking the corridors, lighting candles before the portraits of the fallen. The maids whispered that when the wind passed through the tapestries, it carried the faint scent of her shawl, smoke, frost, and wild roses. The poor, once banished from the gates, now entered freely through the great archway. Every evening, cauldrons of broth steamed in the courtyards. Children who had never tasted sweetness now had honey on their tongues. None of the guards stopped them. None of the nobles dared protest. It was as if the castle itself enforced her law, quiet mercy. No decree had ever been written in her name, yet her will shaped everything. The nobles rebuilt homes in the city below, funded hospitals, and shared their grain. The artisans carved her likeness not in marble, but in wood and glass. Approachable, human, real. Her story spread beyond the walls, carried on songs sung by travelers and minstrels who never met her, yet swore they dreamed of her smile, and every tale ended the same way. She came to serve and left the world learning how to kneel. The throne room, once a theater of pride, now stood almost empty. The walls were bare. The banners had been taken down. Only light filled the space, filtering through the repaired stained glass that still bore faint scars from the night of the curse. The seat of the vampire king, carved from obsidian and crowned with silver veins, was vacant. Kael Valen had vanished. Some said he wandered the borders of the kingdom in human form, guarding travelers at night. Others swore they saw him in the northern forests, speaking to the wind. A few believed he had followed her beyond death, unwilling to rule a world she had redeemed. All that remained of him in the palace was his crown, black iron glinting with dull rubies, resting on the steps below the throne. It had not been placed there ceremoniously. It had been left as though he simply set it down and walked away. No one dared move it. Dust never settled upon it. Each night, when the red glow returned to the palace windows, the crown would shimmer faintly, as though remembering the warmth of her hand. One evening, a young maid sweeping the hall noticed something strange. A single red thread lay across the marble, thin as breath, glowing faintly before it vanished. When she told the steward, he only smiled sadly and said, "She walks again. Be still. She passes when hearts are kind." Word spread, as all miracles do. The peasants began to leave gifts at the palace gates. Not gold, but bread, shawls, and candles wrapped in red twine. No guard turned them away. At dusk, those offerings vanished, and by dawn, warmth returned to the hearths of the givers' homes. The people believed the queen without a crown was watching, and perhaps she was, because sometimes, when the moon rose over the eastern tower, travelers swore they saw a woman's figure standing on the balcony, a silhouette outlined in soft crimson light. Her hair moved as though stirred by unseen wind, her hands clasped before her as she watched the city below. She never spoke. She never moved. Yet those who saw her said they felt peace, as if mercy itself had paused to look upon the world it had saved. One night an old man arrived at the palace gate, blind, weary, wrapped in rags. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to let him through, but then the door opened on its own. A soft red glow led him inside, through corridors now lined with flowers. He reached the throne room and fell to his knees before the empty seat. "My queen," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They said you were gone, but the light never left." The silence answered him, gentle, listening. He felt warmth on his face then, the brush of air soft as fingertips. When he raised his head, he could see, just faintly, a woman's form reflected in the broken glass of the throne's base. No crown, no jewels, only a red thread circling her wrist. Tears filled his eyes. "You're still here," he murmured. The wind seemed to sigh in response. The candles flickered, and the windows blushed crimson once more. By morning, the man was gone, but a small wooden carving of a candle stood where he had knelt. Beneath it, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "Kindness is the only throne that never burns." Years passed. The kingdom flourished, not through conquest, but through compassion. The stories of Lyra and the Vampire King spread far beyond the borders of Blackridge Hollow. Parents told their children the tale of the servant girl who made even immortals kneel. Poets wrote of her red thread, a symbol of courage, of mercy in defiance of cruelty, and in every telling, she was called the same name, the Queen Without a Crown. She was not remembered for her beauty or her sacrifice, but for the warmth she left behind, warmth that could not be touched, yet touched everything. The Crimson Palace stood as a monument not to power, but to transformation. Every stone, every window, every flicker of red light reminded the world of a simple truth. Greatness was not born from bloodlines, but from kindness chosen when cruelty was easier, and on quiet nights, when the moon hung low and the frost crept once more across the valley, the faint echo of her voice could still be heard in the wind, the same words she'd spoken the night her story began. "No one deserves to be left in the cold." The castle lights shimmered faintly in answer, and the kingdom, warmer now, softer now, slept beneath her eternal mercy, because though she came to serve, she left the world learning how to kneel. Would you have stood up for the one everyone scorned, even if the world turned against you? The voices soft, trembling through the echo of fading light. A pause, the sound of wind passing through broken glass, distant bells tolling, because once, a servant girl did, and a kingdom learned the meaning of loyalty, not to blood, but to heart. The camera pans over the empty throne, the red glow breathing through the windows, the faint shimmer of a thread disappearing into the dawn. Silence follows, heavy but warm, like the last heartbeat of a story that refuses to die, fade to black. Across the darkness, the final words bloom in silver light. The queen they tried to break, If her courage moved you, if mercy still feels like magic, then subscribe and join me for more stories that prove one heart can rewrite a world. Until the next dawn, remember her name, the queen they tried to break.